So today I want to talk about Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I know this game's been out for a little bit, 3 weeks, a month, probably by the time you've seen this, but this game has so much hype around it. I've seen so many 10s and perfect scores. I didn't even know what this game was, so it's likely, if you're not the audience for this game, you don't know what this game is still. So I want to talk about it for that group of people. If you already know what this game is, if you're already playing this game, if you're in this genre already and you like D&D and all of that stuff, this video isn't going to be very informative for you because you've more than likely played this game and have probably beaten it at this point. This is for the people that have absolutely no clue what this is, have never heard of this, maybe saw a clip or two on TikTok and want to know more about it. So that's what we're going to go into here, and if all the hype around it is actually accurate from someone who's not in that world and has the perspective of playing D&D and playing games of this type in their typical rotation of what they like to do. So Baldur's Gate 3 is an open world RPG game kind of set in the universe of Dungeons and Dragons. And so when I say open world RPG, that could include things like God of War. It could include Assassin's Creed, but this is not at all like that in the slightest. I have to clarify how RPG-ish this is. I wouldn't even compare it to something like Skyrim or games like that. While those are open world RPGs, don't get me wrong, this is very, very different. So let me just give you a glimpse, again, for those who have absolutely no context into this style of game, as to what you're going to be looking at most of the time you're playing the game. So this is it. There is a lot going on here. A lot of spells and level spells and cantrips and different skill checks and strength, dexterity, all of that good shit. It's very, very confusing. But something the game does very well for people who have absolutely no idea what any of this shit means, like me, is it has this great feature that every single game needs to have, where you can just press T, and any of these words that you see that are highlighted, it tells you exactly what they mean in idiot language, right? It narrows it down for you very simplistically to where on a simplistic scale you can understand what each one of these abilities do, what they mean, how they impact each other, all of that stuff. Now, I know this HUD is very overwhelming, but personally, I watched a 2.5 hour video before I played this game so I could understand it a bit better, but that's not necessary. Like I said, you can use that T inspect feature to go ahead and click on every single one of these things, understand how they work, what a short versus long rest is, how you use those things, blah blah blah. And then if you're like me and it's still overwhelming for you, you can organize your hotbar. So that's something, again, if you're just very overwhelmed by what's all on screen right now, that's something I would recommend, right? Putting all of your melee attacks over here, or your ranged attacks over here, or something that you have to rest to use on this side, and the things that you can use over and over again on this side. And that is how I would recommend not getting immediately overwhelmed when you look at the screen in this game, because that's the biggest turnoff of this game, is how overwhelming it is just to look at. But what's the actual gameplay, right? What do you do? So there's two sides to this game, essentially. The combat, which is what you're watching now, which is turn-based. This is going to be at least a bit familiar if you've played any type of turn-based strategy game, right? You go, you have turns and moves and different abilities that you can use that cost this many action points or this many movement points, and the stronger attacks cost 2, the weaker attacks cost 1, so you can choose to use strategy of if you want to use 2 of your movement points to do more damage, or use 1, and bonus actions and actions, spell slots, all of that good stuff, right? Very confusing. So you'll get the hang of it. This is nothing to be concerned about. You'll like the combat if you like turn-based strategy stuff, right? There's nothing really here that needs to be clarified. You've seen this. This is nothing new or unique. Yes, it's a bit complicated within the D&D context because you have a lot of experimentation you can do, right? If you want to throw down a barrel and then put fire on it that could explode and then bring this wall down and hit this enemy, you have all of these buffs and debuffs and all of these things that work together and kind of make the combat more complicated in a way, but that's what makes it more fun. But again, if you've played any type of turn-based strategy, the combat after your first few encounters will be fairly understandable. Now, that being said, this game isn't all combat. The combat looks fun, and it is fun, especially once you get into those higher levels and you really understand it. But that being said, let me break down a standard play session. So, if you're a normal person and you have to work a full-time job, you get, you know, depending on what other activities you have, 2 to 4 hours of gaming in a day, right? Let's just keep that as your average, right? This is just your theoretical here. The problem with that is, one, again, you can see this is a positive or a negative. The game, just the story, is like 70 hours long from what I've seen. I'm only through Act 1 at 20 hours, so if all the acts are about the same length, that adds up, right? Assuming each act gets more and more complicated and takes longer and longer. Because you will fail fights and have to do them over and over and over again, especially if you're not familiar with how this system works. But in your typical session, you're going to spend about 30 minutes walking around, exploring, trying to find what you're looking for, and kind of just going through the world, going from point of interest to point of interest, essentially. Then you're going to spend a solid, depending on where you're at, 45 minutes to an hour just talking to people, getting lore, but it's different than, again, compared to other open world RPGs like Assassin's Creed, right? That's the one I'm using because that's the example I'm most familiar with. They spit a bunch of useless exposition at you in Assassin's Creed, in side missions and in main missions. That doesn't really add up to anything. Yes, they've gotten better at it, and that's a whole nother video, but for the most part, it's useless exposition to get you to do the thing they want you to do, to move you to the next waypoint or mission marker. Right. Within Baldur's Gate 3, that's not really the case. You could talk to some NPC that's talking about some community event on some other side of the map that's going to take place, and it's just some random ass conversation point that has absolutely nothing to do with the goblin camp that you're going to attack, right? This is just something they said in the chain of dialogue getting to the main point. But you can go do that thing. You can go over there and find that thing that they were just randomly talking about that had absolutely nothing to do with anything. So it's very, very overwhelming in the sense that you're going to get to these points of interest and talk and talk and talk and talk to people. Now, there is a journal, and it keeps track of all of that for you, obviously, because otherwise you would be absolutely screwed. There's so much going on. But if you don't care about the story, you just want to do the combat, there's turn-based combat games out there, go get one of those. If you don't care about like the world and the building and all of that stuff, then you're not going to be interested for as long, because realistically, it's about 70% exploring and conversation, and 25% combat, and then 5% loading when you do something wrong and your whole party dies. So what I'm saying here is that the combat is good, it works, it's not the best combat I've ever played in my entire life, it's good, right? It holds up, it's part of the gameplay. The story and the world building and all of that stuff, if you like that, is really, really good, right? So there's all of that to enjoy, and that's worth the hype, but where people are getting incredibly hyped is what I'm going to call the variability within the game. That's the word we're going to use, right? And so what I mean by that is, in most games, whether you want to say like a Cyberpunk or a Telltale game or something like that, you have options, right? And you have option 1, 2, and 3. And realistically, you get option 1, 2, and 3, and then that'll give you option 4, 5, and 6, and then 7 and 8. But realistically, all of those 8 options result in outcome 1 or outcome 2. You get what I'm saying? One of those 2 things is going to happen regardless of what you pick. And while that's, I'm not saying that doesn't happen here. Obviously, there's a story that has to be followed through, and you're going to go through certain beats and plot points no matter what you pick. But there's so many divulging paths here. That's what makes this game interesting and why so many people are hyped. So let me give you an example to kind of give you the scope, because when most people think of branching gameplay and choices, they think of things like I gave examples of Telltale Cyberpunk, where the choices really don't make that big of a difference, right? But here, let me give you 2 examples. So a story example. There's a guy, I don't have the cover of the game pulled up right now, but he's like white hair, he's a vampire looking guy, I think he's holding like a dagger or something. He's a vampire, right? You meet this guy relatively early on in the game, probably the first, depending on how much you explore, 5 hours of the game. right? And he's on the cover of the game, so I would tend to assume that he's a relatively important character, right? Well, he's dead. I killed him. We killed him. He's not alive anymore. He hasn't been alive. We got really nothing out of him. He's no longer in our game, right? So that obviously is going to drastically change the quests and experiences and things that you can do because that character doesn't exist anymore. Now, this isn't a one-time thing. You can do this all the time, and that also ties in to the gameplay part of it. So, let me give you two examples of this. Something that's determined by you and something that's not. So, relatively early on, keeping with the theme of exploration, right? Before this vampire guy that I was speaking of even, there's some side area you can explore in the first starting region, and it has this dead guy, this skeleton guy in the basement of some crypt, right? And if you recruit this guy to your camp, for 100 gold, you can change your class at any time. Now, I'll get into classes here in a minute, but that's a big deal. For a 70-hour game, if you choose a class that you absolutely hate, you're gonna hate the game, right? Because they all play very differently, and it's not like, oh, well, you know, I get a double jump instead of a single jump. These are like, you literally cannot use these skill sets and these weapons because you chose this class, or you're not good at combat, essentially, because you chose this class, or you can't pass these dialogue options because you chose this class. So this is a big deal, and if you didn't explore that area, you're not going to get this option to change classes. Now, it's like the very first thing you're dropped into, so most people are going to come across it, but that was just an early on example without getting into spoilers. Let me talk about classes, and so this is the one aspect of the game you're going to want to pay attention to, because while races and what race you choose can affect your skills and what abilities you get and all of that stuff, your dialogue options, it's not as much as your class is going to, and this is really important. And so as someone from outside of this type of game, it's, in my opinion, really split into three subcategories. Your gladiator, your fighter, and other classes like that are your combat ones, your paladins, all of them, they're focused on combat, whether it's through healing or dealing damage. They really excel at the combat part of the game. Now, I'm not saying you can't do things to be good at conversation or be good at other parts of the game, but they're good at combat, right? That's what all of your skills that you're going to get through leveling are going to increase is your combat ability. Then you have classes that focus on magic, your wizard, warlock, sorcerer, all of those. Right, and again, same thing that goes for those combat classes. I'm not saying you can't be good at dialogue because you will have unique dialogue options and all of that, but they focus on magic abilities, whether in conversation or healing or doing attack damage through spells, and it's completely different than doing it through melee or ranged attacks. Right, and then you have your conversationalists. Right, these are bard, other classes in that category, and again, being repetitive like the other two, they can't not be good at combat. They have abilities and spells and all of that stuff, but they really excel in the dialogue. And that sounds boring as fuck, but in a game that has so much dialogue, and choosing the wrong dialogue option or getting a bad roll could result in you having to fight an entire camp of enemies for hours on end over and over and over and over again, dialogue is very important. So each one of them has their buffs and their debuffs that make them different and unique from the others, and you can always choose a multi-class, and again, once you find this skeleton guy for your camp, change your class while you're in the game. Now, I don't want to go too much into the classes because there's videos that are hours long that will tell you the strengths, weaknesses, and pretty much every single ability you can get for every single class. In a game like this, and something like Diablo 4 where that's so important, I highly recommend looking at the classes before you choose them, because early on 100 gold is a decent amount of gold and you don't want to be wasting that if you absolutely hate your class. So I would recommend at least a little bit of diving into the class so you don't end up getting this game over screen consistently like I do. Now, is this game worth the hype? Well, if you're into this type of stuff, if you're in these types of games, D&D and all of that, obviously you're gonna like this game. Right, it's tailor-made for you. It's not who I'm talking to here. It's people that aren't familiar with this at all, or really haven't played too much of D&D, or don't really know much about this at all. So, is it an absolute banger, absolute 10 out of 10? Well, that depends, right? Even me, I would say, a fair amount of patience when it comes to story to gameplay, right? I like a lot of story, and if the gameplay is just average, and the story's really good, that's fine, that works for me. But if you don't care about story, you're gonna get bored. Even I just spacebar through some dialogue sometimes because I'm bored and I need to get to a fight, and that always ends badly, right? If you're somebody who can't be interested and get involved, for example, here what you're seeing, this is like a faction war, right, between these two people. There's probably a solid hour and a half of just fucking dialogue in this section of the game between these two groups and why they're fighting and why one wants to leave their safe zone and one wants to stay and why they want to fight and all of that stuff. And you can choose to do this and have them fight each other, or you can choose to help them. Now, the gameplay consequences of that will come eventually and you'll get to your combat. But if you're somebody who is so bored and can't be interested in that dynamic of the two groups clashing and, oh, I gotta help these people because I don't want the groups to fight, and you just want to get to the fight, get to the fight, get to the fight, get to the fight, the game, unless you play on the easiest difficulty, is going to punish you for that. They don't necessarily have level restrictions like, oh, you're level 10, they're level 15, you can't do this, like in other RPG games, but you're gonna face enemies with like 130 health and you have 12. So you're really not going to stand a chance. So the dialogue is a huge part of this. If you're an absolute, let me put this in gamer terms, right? If you're an absolute cracked Call of Duty kid, you're going to be bored as shit. You're not going to enjoy this. You're going to say, where's my combat, where's my combat, where's my combat, where's my combat? You're going to try to fight at every single encounter, and you can do that. But if you don't at least enjoy the story bits of it, you're going to get bored. And I'm not saying this game is perfect, right? It has problems. It's not a fucking perfect 10 out of 10 game of the year game. It has its issues. There's certain things that aren't communicated well. There's certain things that are just so fucking annoying that don't make any sense, in my opinion. Like, let me give you a quick example again. I'm trying to keep this video relatively short for those of you guys deciding if you want to buy the game or not. But you have to roll for some things in the game. This is going to turn into a rant already, I can tell. But you have to roll, let's say, to see if you persuade this guy or deceive this guy when in conversation. But then, when you're just walking around throughout the world, they can say, perception check failed, and then you just blow up to a trap. Give me a roll. Same thing with stealth. It was like, stealth check failed. Give me a roll, right? And this is gonna sound like the stupidest shit anyone's ever said, but the dice, watching the fucking stupid-ass digital dice roll on the screen is the best part of the game. Do it more. That's the fun part, right? Like, yes, it sounds like it would be annoying, but being like, oh, well, because my character is this, I have these buffs, and I have these debuffs, and this and that and that. I swear rolling the dice is the most fun part of the game. I wish they did it more. So I have problems with the game. I don't think it's a perfect 10. Obviously, I can't fully review the game, that's why this is an after the hype video and not a review, because I'm only through Act 1, and Starfield's gonna be out before I finish this game. So, if I had to give this a score right now through Act 1, I'd probably, depending on who you're playing it with, personally, I'd put it at an 8. It's very good, it's good at what it does, but it has problems, and it doesn't communicate how to do things to unfamiliar players in the best way. Now, that being said, you can certainly get by, but should you buy this game, right? If you're not familiar with the world and you have nobody to play with, that's the big one, I'd probably wait for a sale for this game. Now, because everyone's saying it's the best game ever, is going to go on sale anytime soon, probably not. But the game is definitely more fun and less overwhelming with more people. Because while this isn't a review and I don't want to go over every aspect of the game, you do have to control, if you're playing by yourself, 4 characters, manage the inventory and the slots and the hotbar of 4 characters at once. And you're constantly changing out those characters because you have a camp and different characters are better doing certain things and you have to bring certain people on certain missions. And so you really have 4+ characters that you're constantly changing the hotbars and the skill between, and have to remember, okay, this guy's good at this, and this guy has this ability, and this guy has that ability. Again, if you're familiar with the world and all of the D&D stuff and the context and all of that, it works. It's not a problem. It makes sense. But for somebody who's never been exposed to this before, you have a lot of new information and you have to juggle a lot of it all at once. So the more people you can play with here, obviously more multiplayer games are more fun with friends, but it's less overwhelming. You don't have to juggle as many things at once. But that's just my opinion on the game. This is where the video is going to split into a whole new video because, again, Starfield is coming out in like 6 days, and I'm not going to have the time to finish making a video on this game, a full review once it finishes, and then another video that I want to make. So we're going to go ahead and split the video here. If you came here to see, you know, what I think of the game, if it's worth it, all that good stuff, this is where you can leave. This is where you've made it to the end of the video, I should say. Now I'm going to split into a new topic and kind of let the video essayist, you know, games journalist side of me take over and talk about how this game relates to Cyberpunk 2077. So, I know that sounds like an absolutely absurd topic, but you guys let me know what you think of this game and all of that good stuff down in the comments below if you're familiar with this world and all of that good stuff. I'm going to do an outro here like this is the end of the video, but let's go ahead and switch gears. So how the fuck does Baldur's Gate 3 relate to Cyberpunk 2077? And so, while gameplay-wise, it's really in no slightest of a fraction way similar to Cyberpunk at all. But storytelling and the way choices are handled and questing and all that stuff, this is the perfect comparison, right? Because, well, if I would have had the time and have made 2 videos, I would have titled it Baldur's Gate 3 is what Cyberpunk should have been, or something along those lines. Cyberpunk and all of the marketing for it was shown as this game, this huge open world with all these things to do and different choices. There was such a huge, emphasis on choosing your class here, or your starting lifestyle, I guess, if that's what you want to call it. Whether you want to be a corpo, or you wanted to be, what the fuck are they called? The street kid, or the nomad. And there was such a huge emphasis on all of this stuff. And oh yeah, your choices matter and all of that. But they fucking don't. The only choice that matters in all of Cyberpunk is the last one. Whether you hated the game and kill yourself before you have to play the last mission, or you play the last mission. Those are essentially the 2 big choices, right? And now, I've only played the game once, and that was at launch when it was an absolute shit show, and I'm going to go back to it when this new expansion comes out here in, what, a month? But there's so many things that Baldur's Gate 3 does right, and it could be here for hours, but it's really choice and how that affects the story and the player is what Baldur's Gate does so much fucking better than Cyberpunk. So let me dive a bit into that without sounding repetitive. In Cyberpunk, much like the first half of this video where I compared it to Assassin's Creed, most of the dialogue options you're choosing because you're a certain class and proficient with certain things don't change the outcome that much. It's very much this or this is going to happen. It's 2 choices, and those 2 choices are already predetermined within the shuffleboard of the story, let's say, right? If you were to take a diagram of the way Cyberpunk and like Telltale and all of those types of choice-based games do their storytelling, they essentially have 2, sometimes 3 endings, right? And then you take the branch backward, take the tree, let's say, the timeline, backwards to the beginning. Maybe at most you're hitting 5 branching points, right? Oh, well, because you chose to do this side quest and help this guy is alive at the end of the game instead of this guy, right? Or something like that, right? But in Baldur's Gate, it's much like if you look at the Detroit Become Human, right? The timelines in that game, where there's just fucking a billion things all over the fucking screen, right? That's how Cyberpunk should have been. If you chose to be a street kid, and then you chose to be a corpo, those gameplay options, the story, all of it, should have been drastically different. Not just, well, can I jump higher? Am I quieter when I crouch? Things like that, right? And while those need to be in there as gameplay elements, the story needs to feel different, like you're actually making a difference. In Baldur's Gate 3, when we have a bard do a conversation, and this dude passes every single conversation, every single dice roll, because he's so good at conversation, has such high charisma, versus you have my character, like a paladin, a combat class, look into a conversation and talk, and fail every single conversation, and constantly end up in combat, constantly resulting in different outcomes, blowing up whole devices, ruining side plot lines. Like, that's what Cyberpunk should have been. And I recently watched the Cyberpunk anime, right? The Edge Runners thing. And that just made me want to play Cyberpunk more, and it really pissed me off that Cyberpunk was bad. Because I am more into futuristic stuff and the sci-fi shit and all of that. So, I'm all for Cyberpunk. I want it to be good. And the foundation is there, right? The story threads within the game, even though I hated the story, the threads that are there, the foundation, the world is good. The anime is really fucking good. But interweaving that story and the world and the foundation with the gameplay aspects of it is where the whole thing went to shit, right? And so I'm hoping with this expansion coming out that they will be able to, since they're basically redefining the whole fucking game, one, actually put gameplay mechanics that have been in games since 2004, like cop chases, and intertwine the story and the gameplay choices a bit heavier, right? If I choose to heavily augment myself with the cyberware and all of that stuff, have that affect the fucking story, right? Have that have a different outcome than if I stay as a normal ass dude, right? And just try to be 100% human and just try to gun runner make my way through, right? I don't want to get to the end of this expansion that I'm paying, what is it, $30? $30 for, and Idris Elba is like, hey, I'm a bad guy, or hey, I'm a good guy, or hey, I die, or hey, I don't die. You know what I mean? Like, there needs to be constant changes, constant choices if you're gonna do this level of RPG with this level of hype, and then the world needs to feel lived in, right? Baldur's Gate 3, there's people everywhere, and everyone has something to say, right? It might not be the most important shit, but they have something to say, or something to trade, kind of input to give you on the situation. In Cyberpunk, it felt so empty. There were so many people doing absolutely nothing. And again, I haven't played Cyberpunk in well over a year at this point, but it needs so many improvements, and it can be good. And Baldur's Gate, again, this game took fucking like 15 years to make, but Baldur's Gate proves that you can do all of these gameplay elements and gameplay choices and combine them with the story choices and with the story elements and make them work together well and still make a coherent story that makes sense, right? You have so many options in Baldur's Gate, and it makes every playthrough feel unique. Baldur's Gate 3 is the first game of this type of magnitude that I would say is actually worth replaying, right? Replaying Cyberpunk to not date the black cop guy, that's like, I'm not gonna do that, right? Replaying Cyberpunk to try different cyberware on, I'm not gonna do that. I'll just load my last save and buy the new ones. When you choose a different class, or choose different abilities, or choose a different, side to go within a faction war in Baldur's Gate 3, it drastically changes things. And that's what games need to do. Now, this whole thing around Baldur's Gate 3 is saying, oh, well, you can't hold games up to this standard because this game took fucking 15 years to make. So did Cyberpunk. So is GTA 6. So is Elder Scrolls 6. All of these games that are, games that you're never going to forget, games that you're going to remember forever because they either sucked or were fantastic, have always taken so long to make. And I'd rather have a Call of Duty every 15 years and it be the most fantastic, story-driven, fucking co-op John Wick game that I've ever played in my life, and then play the same shit every single year, where they go into their library of assets and just choose futuristic skin, World War II skin, Cold War skin, and then just release the game again, right? Because that's what they do. And this has become a rant, but my point is, Baldur's Gate 3 proves that you can take choices from both a story perspective and a gameplay perspective and put them together in a way to where they mesh and feel natural and allow for more options for another playthrough, right? That's my point I'm trying to make here. That's what Cyberpunk needed to do. It's what it needs to do if it's going to continue on or make a sequel or whatever their plan is. That's where Cyberpunk needs to go. But I've had my rant here. You guys let me know what you think of Baldur's Gate 3, what you thought of Cyberpunk, if you're excited for the upcoming expansion, or if you've said fuck it and you're done with the game. Let me know all that good stuff down in the comments below, and I'll see you guys on the next one.